What if everything you've been taught about achieving your desires is backwards? What if the very act of wanting keeps you from having? There exists a profound paradox that escapes most minds. The moment you assume your desire is already fulfilled, you step into a reality where it must manifest. Not because of magic, not because of wishful thinking, but because assumption changes the very fabric of your consciousness. Most people live in the prison of perpetual wanting. They say, "I want more money." They declare, "I want love." They repeat, "I want success." Each time they speak these words, they reinforce their current state of lacking. Want implies absence. Want creates distance between you and your desire. The ancient masters understood something modern minds have forgotten. They knew that consciousness is the only reality. They knew that what you assume to be true becomes your lived experience. They practiced a way of being that transcends the ordinary mind's limitations. Think of a river flowing toward the ocean. The river doesn't want to reach the ocean. The river assumes it will reach the ocean. This assumption is built into its very nature. The river moves with certainty, not hope. It flows with knowing, not wishing. You possess this same certainty within you. You have simply forgotten how to access it. When you assume your desire is already fulfilled, you stop chasing. You stop grasping. You stop the desperate energy that repels what you seek. Instead, you align with the natural flow of manifestation. Consider the difference between a beggar and a king. The beggar hopes for coins. The king assumes abundance. The beggar's posture reveals lack. The king's presence emanates wealth. One operates from emptiness, the other from fullness. Your consciousness operates by the same principle. Most people approach their desires like beggars approaching a palace. They stand outside looking in, hoping someone will notice them. They knock tentatively on the door, expecting rejection. They speak their requests with doubt in their voice. The master of assumption walks differently, breathes differently, thinks differently. They don't approach the palace from outside. They recognize they already reside within its walls. This recognition changes everything. Your nervous system cannot distinguish between what you vividly assume and what you physically experience. When you assume fulfillment completely, your body responds as if the desire is already yours. Your thoughts align. Your actions naturally follow. Your entire being reorganizes around this new assumption. But here lies the challenge most face. They confuse assumption with pretending. They confuse it with positive thinking. They confuse it with denial of current circumstances. Assumption is none of these things. Assumption is a state of consciousness. It's the deep inner knowing that transcends surface thoughts. It's the quiet certainty that needs no external validation. It's the stillness that contains all movement. Watch a master craftsman at work. They don't hope their hands will create beauty. They assume their skill will manifest through their tools. This assumption flows through every gesture, every breath, every moment of creation. The assumption of fulfilled desire operates the same way. When you truly assume your desire is fulfilled, you stop looking for evidence in the outer world. You stop checking your bank account every hour when you've assumed wealth. You stop analyzing every interaction when you've assumed love. You stop seeking validation when you've assumed success. The outer world becomes irrelevant to your inner knowing. This creates space. This space allows transformation. This transformation brings manifestation. Most people reverse this process. They wait for the outer world to change before they allow their inner world to shift. They wait for money before they feel wealthy. They wait for love before they feel lovable. They wait for success before they feel successful. This backwards approach keeps them locked in endless cycles of wanting without having. The master reverses the flow. They feel wealthy now. They feel loved now. They feel successful now. Not because they ignore reality, but because they understand a deeper reality. Consciousness creates experience, not the other way around. Your current circumstances are the hardened forms of your past assumptions. What you assume to be true about yourself, about life, about possibility. These assumptions crystallized into your present reality. This recognition brings both responsibility and tremendous power. If your past assumptions created your current circumstances, then your present assumptions are creating your future circumstances. Every moment offers you the opportunity to assume differently, but most minds resist this power. They prefer the familiar prison of wanting to the unknown territory of having. They choose the comfort of limitation over the responsibility of expansion. The ego finds safety in lacking. When you lack, you can blame circumstances. When you lack, you can remain small. When you lack, you don't have to face the magnificence of your true nature. Assumption requires courage. It requires you to stand in your power, even when the outer world reflects your old assumptions. It requires you to maintain inner certainty while surrounded by apparent contradiction. This is the warrior's path. The spiritual warrior doesn't fight external enemies. They master the battlefield of consciousness. They conquer the tendency to doubt, to fear, to retreat into old patterns of thinking. When you assume your desire is fulfilled, you declare war on limitation. You refuse to bow to circumstances. You choose to live from cause rather than effect. Most people live as effects of their conditions. Happy when conditions are good. Sad when conditions are challenging. Hopeful when things look promising. Despairing when things look bleak. The master of assumption lives as the cause of their experience. They choose their inner state regardless of outer conditions. They maintain the assumption of fulfillment even when appearances suggest otherwise. This consistency of assumption creates momentum. This momentum builds power. This power transforms reality. Think of assumption as planting a seed in the rich soil of consciousness. The seed doesn't doubt its ability to grow. It doesn't question whether the soil will support it. It simply begins the process of becoming what it already is in potential. Your assumptions are the seeds you plant in the field of awareness. Most people plant seeds of doubt. What if it doesn't work? They plant seeds of fear. What if I'm not worthy? They plant seeds of limitation. What if it's not possible for someone like me? These seeds grow exactly as planted. The master plants seeds of certainty. They assume worthiness. They assume possibility. They assume fulfillment. These seeds also grow exactly as planted. The soil of consciousness is neutral. It grows whatever you plant with equal efficiency. It doesn't judge your assumptions as good or bad, realistic or unrealistic. It simply responds to the consistency and depth of your inner conviction. When you assume your desire is already fulfilled, you plant the most powerful seed possible. You plant the seed of completion rather than seeking, of having rather than wanting, of being rather than becoming. This seed requires careful tending. The assumption of fulfilled desire must be maintained through all circumstances. When the outer world reflects your old assumptions, you maintain your new assumption. When others question your certainty, you maintain your new assumption. When your own mind generates doubt, you maintain your new assumption. This maintenance is not forced. It's not through gritted teeth or desperate willpower. It's through the gentle, consistent returning to your chosen state of consciousness. Like a musician tuning an instrument, you continuously tune your awareness to the frequency of fulfillment. When you notice you've slipped into wanting, you gently return to assuming. When you catch yourself looking for evidence, you gently return to inner knowing. This practice transforms both your inner and outer worlds. Internally, you develop unshakable peace. You stop being at the mercy of circumstances. You stop riding the emotional roller coaster of hope and disappointment. You rest in the quiet certainty of fulfilled desire. Externally, your entire life begins to reorganize around your new assumption. Opportunities align. People respond differently. Synchronicities multiply. What seemed impossible becomes natural. But these external changes are not the goal. They are the natural byproducts of inner transformation. The goal is the mastery of consciousness itself. The goal is the recognition of your true power. The goal is the liberation from the prison of perpetual wanting. When you live in the assumption of fulfilled desire, you stop being a victim of circumstances. You stop being dependent on others for your happiness. You stop waiting for someday and start living fully now. This is not about getting what you want. This is about becoming who you are. Most people spend their lives trying to get things that will make them feel complete. They chase money, relationships, achievements, recognition, always looking for the next thing that will finally bring satisfaction. The master of assumption recognizes they are already complete. Their desires are not desperate attempts to fill emptiness. Their desires are expressions of their fullness seeking form. This recognition changes the entire game. From this place of completion, desire becomes play rather than survival. Manifestation becomes natural rather than forced. Life becomes an adventure rather than a struggle. You stop asking, how can I get what I want? You start knowing, I already have what I desire. This shift in consciousness creates the very conditions that allow your desire to manifest in physical form. The assumption of fulfilled desire is not a technique to manipulate reality. It is the recognition of your true relationship with reality. You are not separate from what you desire. You are not trying to attract something foreign to your nature. What you desire already exists within the field of your consciousness. Assumption simply makes the invisible visible, the potential actual, the inner outer. This truth has been taught by masters throughout history, though often veiled in metaphor and symbol. They knew that direct teaching of this principle could be dangerous in unprepared minds. They knew that consciousness requires seasoning, like wood requires aging before it can hold weight. But these times call for direct teaching. These times require the unveiling of ancient wisdom. These times demand that you step into your full power. The world needs individuals who live from assumption rather than limitation. The world needs beings who demonstrate what's possible when consciousness is properly directed. The world needs you to embody the truths of fulfilled desire. This embodiment begins now, not when conditions are perfect, not when you feel ready, not when you have more knowledge or preparation. Now, right now, you can choose to assume your deepest desire is already fulfilled. Right now you can step into the consciousness of having rather than wanting. Right now you can begin living as the person who already possesses what they seek. This choice creates immediate shifts in your energy, your presence, your entire being. These shifts ripple outward, affecting everything and everyone around you. These ripples eventually return as the physical manifestation of your assumption. But the manifestation is secondary. The primary gift is the transformation of your consciousness itself. The primary reward is the recognition of your own power. The primary achievement is the mastery of your inner world. When you master your inner world, the outer world must respond accordingly. This is not belief. This is law. This is the fundamental principle governing all of existence. Consciousness is cause. Experience is effect. Assumption directs consciousness. Manifestation follows assumption. Understanding this sequence gives you the key to transformation. Practicing this sequence gives you mastery over your life experience. Most people try to change effects while leaving causes untouched. They try to modify circumstances while maintaining the same assumptions that created those circumstances. This approach leads to temporary changes at best, and usually to frustration and disappointment. The master works at the level of cause. They change their assumptions, knowing that circumstances must inevitably follow. They patient like the farmer who plants seeds and trusts the harvest will come in due season. This patience is not passive waiting. This patience is active assumption. This patience is the unwavering maintenance of inner certainty regardless of current appearances. When you truly assume your desire is fulfilled, you don't desperately seek signs of its manifestation. You don't anxiously check for progress. You don't worry about timing or methods. You simply live from the consciousness of already having what you desire. You breathe as the fulfilled version of yourself. You move as the person who lacks nothing. You respond to life from abundance rather than scarcity. This way of being is itself the manifestation. Everything else, the money, the relationship, the success, the recognition, these are simply the outer forms that consciousness takes when properly directed. But most minds resist this simplicity. They want complex formulas, elaborate techniques, detailed instructions. They want to do something rather than be something. The ego prefers complicated processes because they maintain the illusion that manifestation is difficult, that transformation requires struggle, that you must earn what you desire through effort and sacrifice. Assumption reveals the ego's deception. Assumption shows that you already are what you seek to become. Assumption demonstrates that having is your natural state, wanting is the aberration. This revelation threatens the ego's entire structure. The ego exists by maintaining the sense of separation between you and your desires. When assumption collapses this separation, the ego loses its function. This is why assumption feels uncomfortable at first. This is why the mind generates doubt, fear, and resistance when you attempt to live from fulfilled desire. These responses are not signs that assumption isn't working. They are signs that assumption is working too well for the ego's comfort. The comfortable prison of wanting offers the ego certainty. It knows how to operate in the familiar territory of lack and limitation. It has practiced the habits of hoping, wishing, and trying for years or decades. Assumption threatens this comfortable misery. Assumption demands that you step into unknown territory. Assumption requires that you release familiar patterns and embrace a new way of being. This transition period challenges every fiber of conditioned thinking. Old thoughts arise automatically. Old emotions surface unexpectedly. Old behaviors attempt to reassert themselves. This is the testing ground of assumption. This is where most people retreat back to the familiar prison of wanting. This is where the warrior spirit is required. The spiritual warrior doesn't battle external forces. They face the internal resistance to their own transformation. They meet the fear of their own power with courage. They answer the doubt of their own worthiness with unwavering self-acceptance. When you choose to live in the assumption of fulfilled desire, you declare yourself ready for this battle. You announce your willingness to release everything that doesn't serve your highest good. You commit to the complete transformation of your consciousness. This commitment is not made once. This commitment is renewed with every breath, every thought, every choice. This commitment becomes the foundation of your new life. From this foundation, everything else builds naturally. Your relationships improve because you no longer seek completion through others. Your work becomes more fulfilling because you no longer depend on external validation. Your health improves because you no longer carry the stress of desperate wanting. These improvements are not the result of trying to improve. They are the natural consequences of living from assumption rather than limitation. When you assume you already have what you desire, you stop the energy patterns that create resistance, struggle, and delay. You align with the flow of natural manifestation. You cooperate with the laws of consciousness rather than fighting against them. This cooperation brings ease to what was once difficult. It brings grace to what was once forced. It brings joy to what was once struggle. The assumption of fulfilled desire is ultimately about returning to your natural state. It's about remembering what you knew before you learned to doubt, fear, and limit yourself. It's about reclaiming the power you gave away to circumstances, other people, and false beliefs. This power was never actually lost. This power was only covered by layers of conditioning, programming, and forgetting. Assumption strips away these layers, revealing the luminous consciousness that you truly are. This consciousness lacks nothing. This consciousness fears nothing. This consciousness is complete, whole, and perfect, exactly as it is. From this recognition, all desires become expressions of joy rather than attempts to escape pain. All manifestations become celebrations of consciousness rather than desperate attempts to fill emptiness. This is the shift that changes everything. This is the recognition that sets you free. This is the assumption that fulfills all desires by revealing you were never separate from them in the first place. The journey from wanting to having is actually the journey from forgetting to remembering. The path from limitation to freedom is actually the path from illusion to truth. The transformation from seeker to finder is actually the transformation from dreaming to awakening. You are not trying to become something you are not. You are remembering something you have always been. You are not trying to get something you lack. You are recognizing something you have always possessed. This recognition is the foundation of assumptive living. This recognition is the source of all transformation. This recognition is the key that unlocks the prison of perpetual wanting and opens the door to fulfilled desire. Now comes the practical question that every awakening mind asks. How do you maintain this assumption when everything around you seems to contradict it? How do you live from fulfillment when your bank account shows emptiness? How do you breathe with certainty when your circumstances whisper doubt? The answer lies not in techniques or methods but in three fundamental pillars that support all assumptive living. These pillars have held the weight of transformation for countless masters throughout history. They will hold yours as well. But first you must understand something crucial. These are not steps to follow. These are not exercises to practice for a few minutes each day. These are ways of being that must become as natural as breathing, as constant as your heartbeat, as reliable as the rising sun. The first pillar stands in perfect stillness. The second moves with warrior-like precision. The third bridges heaven and earth through embodied presence. Together, they create an unshakable foundation for living as your fulfilled self. Watch how a mountain stands. It doesn't struggle to maintain its position. It doesn't doubt its ability to remain solid. It doesn't question whether it deserves to reach toward the sky. The mountain simply is what it is, completely and without apology. Your assumption of fulfilled desire must possess this same quality of natural certainty, not forced, not strained, not defended, simply present, like the mountain's presence, like the ocean's depth, like the sky's vastness. The first pillar teaches you this quality of being. It reveals how stillness becomes your greatest power, how silence holds your deepest wisdom, how the space between thoughts contains infinite possibility. Most people fear stillness because in stillness they meet themselves without distraction. They encounter the raw truth of their consciousness without the buffers of constant activity, endless thoughts or external stimulation. But the master of assumption seeks this meeting. They understand that stillness is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is not absence, it is presence. It is not void. It is the pregnant space from which all creation emerges. When you can rest in this stillness while maintaining the assumption of your fulfilled desire, you tap into the source of all manifestation. You align with the creative principle that moves through all existence. Think of how a seed rests in the earth. Perfect stillness on the surface. Tremendous power stirring beneath. The seed doesn't frantically try to grow. It doesn't worry about the process. It rests in the quiet certainty of its own nature while powerful forces work through it. Your assumption operates the same way. When you can hold your desire in the stillness of absolute certainty, forces beyond your conscious understanding begin organizing reality around that assumption. This brings us to the second pillar, the distinction between reacting and responding. Most people live their entire lives in reaction. Something happens, they react. Someone speaks, they react. Circumstances change, they react. Reaction comes from unconsciousness. Reaction is automatic. Reaction gives your power away to external conditions. Response comes from consciousness. Response is chosen. Response maintains your power regardless of what unfolds around you. The warrior of consciousness responds to life from the assumption of fulfilled desire. When circumstances appear to contradict their assumption, they don't react with doubt or fear. They respond with deeper certainty. When others question their path, they don't react with defensiveness or explanation. They respond with quiet confidence in their chosen reality. When the old patterns of thinking attempt to reassert themselves, they don't react with struggle or resistance. They respond with gentle but firm redirection toward their assumed truth. This quality of response rather than reaction becomes the hallmark of masterful living. It demonstrates that you have become cause rather than effect, creator rather than victim, master rather than slave to circumstances. But response requires something most people have forgotten how to access: magnetize, the space between stimulus and choice. In that space lives your freedom. In that space lives your power. In that space lives your ability to choose assumption over limitation. The third pillar bridges this inner mastery with outer expression. It teaches you how to embody your assumptions so completely that every cell of your being radiates the truth of fulfilled desire. Most people try to manifest from the neck up. They think the right thoughts, visualize the desired outcomes, repeat affirmations, but their body tells a different story. Their posture speaks of defeat. Their breathing reveals anxiety. Their movements betray doubt. The master understands that consciousness expresses through the entire being. When you truly assume your desire is fulfilled, your body naturally aligns with that assumption. Your breathing deepens. Your posture straightens. Your movements flow with quiet confidence. This is not about pretending or performing. This is about allowing your physical form to express the truth of your inner assumption. This is about becoming so identified with your fulfilled self that the distinction between inner and outer dissolves. These three pillars work together like the legs of a tripod. Remove one, and the structure becomes unstable. Strengthen all three, and nothing can shake your foundation. The stillness of the first pillar gives you unshakable inner knowing. The responsiveness of the second pillar maintains your power in all circumstances. The embodiment of the third pillar makes your assumption tangible and real. Now, how do you cultivate these pillars? How do you transform understanding into living experience? The cultivation begins with breath, not because breath is mystical or magical, but because breath is the bridge between conscious and unconscious, between voluntary and involuntary, between mind and body. When you breathe consciously while holding your assumption of fulfilled desire, you anchor that assumption in your nervous system. You make it real, at the cellular level. You transform abstract concept into lived reality. But this is not about special breathing techniques or complicated practices. This is about bringing consciousness to the most fundamental act of living, the simple in and out of breath. As you breathe in, you inhale the reality of your fulfilled desire. As you breathe out, you release any contradiction to that reality. With each breath, you deepen your identification with the person who already has what you seek. This conscious breathing creates the stillness that forms your first pillar. In the space between inhalation and exhalation, you find the pregnant where all possibilities exist simultaneously. In that your assumption takes root. From this rooted stillness you develop the capacity to respond rather than react. When you are anchored in breath-centered awareness, external circumstances lose their power to throw you off balance. You maintain your chosen state regardless of what swirls around you. This is how warriors have trained throughout history, not by learning to fight, but by learning to remain centered in the midst of chaos. Not by developing aggression, but by cultivating unshakable inner peace that allows for right action. The spiritual warrior applies these same principles to the battlefield of consciousness. They remain centered in their assumption, while the world attempts to convince them otherwise. They maintain their chosen state while old patterns fight for dominance. This inner centeredness naturally expresses through your physical form. When you are truly established in the assumption of fulfilled desire, your body becomes its vehicle of expression. You walk differently when you assume abundance rather than lack. You breathe differently when you assume love rather than loneliness. You move differently when you assume success rather than failure. These are not forced changes. These are not performed behaviors. These are the natural expressions of shifted consciousness. Watch someone who has just received news of great fortune. Notice how their entire being lights up. Their posture changes instantly. Their voice carries new tones. Their movements flow with different energy. Now consider this: that same transformation is available to you right now through the power of assumption. You don't need to wait for external confirmation. You don't need to receive news from outside yourself. You can choose to inhabit the consciousness of great fortune. Now, you can allow that consciousness to express through your being now. You can live from that reality now. This choice activates all three pillars simultaneously. The stillness that knows your desire is already fulfilled. The responsiveness that maintains this knowing regardless of circumstances. The embodiment that makes this knowing visible and tangible. But here lies the challenge that stops most people. They can access these states temporarily, in meditation, in moments of inspiration, in peak experiences. But they cannot sustain them through ordinary life. They assume fulfillment during their morning practice, then slip back into wanting by afternoon. They embody confidence in private, then return to doubt in public. They respond from power in comfortable situations, then react from fear when challenged. This inconsistency undermines the entire process. Assumption requires constancy. It demands that you maintain your chosen state through all conditions and circumstances. Think of assumption like tuning a musical instrument. You don't tune once and expect it to remain perfect forever. You continuously make small adjustments to maintain the proper frequency. The same applies to your consciousness. You continuously tune your awareness back to the frequency of fulfilled desire. When you notice you've slipped into wanting, you gently return to assuming. When you catch yourself reacting,
You consciously choose to respond. This ongoing adjustment is not evidence of failure. This is the natural process of transformation. This is how consciousness reshapes itself from limitation to freedom. The key is gentleness with yourself during this process. Most people approach transformation like warriors approaching battle with force, determination, and exhaustion. They try to eliminate old patterns through struggle and willpower.
The master approaches transformation like a gardener tends plants, with patience, consistency, and trust in natural processes. They don't force growth, they create conditions that allow growth to unfold naturally. These conditions include the cultivation of presence, the practice of response over reaction, and the embodiment of your fulfilled self in every moment possible. Presence is not a state you achieve once and maintain forever. Presence is a choice you make moment by moment. Each time you choose presence over distraction, you strengthen your capacity to live from assumption rather than limitation. Each time you choose response over reaction, you reclaim power you had given to external circumstances. Each time you choose embodiment over presence, you make your inner reality more tangible and real. These choices accumulate. These choices build momentum. These choices eventually tip the scales from old patterns to new reality. But the tipping point cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced. It cannot be achieved through desperate effort or anxious striving. The tipping point arrives through consistent practice of assumptive living, through daily choice of fulfillment over lack, through moment-by-moment selection of presence over unconsciousness. When you have practiced these three pillars long enough, something miraculous happens. You stop practicing them. You start being them. The stillness is no longer something you access. The stillness becomes who you are. The responsiveness is no longer something you choose. The responsiveness becomes your natural way of being. The embodiment is no longer something you do. The embodiment becomes your authentic expression. At this point, the assumption of fulfilled desire is no longer an assumption. It becomes your lived reality. It becomes the foundation from which you operate. It becomes the truth you emanate without effort or intention. This transformation happens not through years of struggle, but through consistency of practice. Not through perfection of technique, but through sincerity of intention. Not through elimination of challenges, but through mastery of response to challenges. The challenges will come. The old patterns will surface. The external world will test your assumption in countless ways. These are not obstacles to your transformation. These are opportunities to strengthen your foundation. These are invitations to go deeper into the truth of who you are. Each challenge met with stillness rather than agitation builds the first pillar. Each reaction transformed into conscious response strengthens the second pillar. Each moment of authentic embodiment solidifies the third pillar. Over time, these pillars become so strong that nothing can shake them. Your assumption of fulfilled desire becomes unshakable, not because you force it to be, but because you have built it on bedrock rather than sand. This bedrock is your true nature. This bedrock is consciousness itself. This bedrock is the unchanging awareness that witnesses all change while remaining eternally stable. When your assumption is built on this foundation, it cannot be destroyed by circumstances. It cannot be shaken by others' opinions. It cannot be undermined by temporary setbacks or apparent delays. From this unshakable foundation, you begin to live as the fulfilled version of yourself, not as a practice but as your natural state. Not as something you do, but as who you are. This becomes the launching point for the final phase of transformation. The complete integration of assumptive living into every aspect of your existence. The total alignment of inner knowing with outer expression. The full embodiment of your highest potential. What happens when you stop being someone who practices assumption and become someone who simply lives from fulfillment? What changes when the three pillars become so natural that you forget you ever lived any other way? Everything changes, yet nothing changes. The paradox of complete transformation is that it appears both revolutionary and completely natural. Revolutionary because your entire relationship with reality shifts, natural because you are simply returning to your authentic state of being. Think of a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. The transformation is complete, irreversible, magnificent. Yet the butterfly doesn't struggle to be a butterfly. It doesn't practice flying. It doesn't remember being a caterpillar with longing or regret. It simply is what it has become. This is the hallmark of integrated assumptive living. You don't remember limitation with nostalgia. You don't practice fulfillment with effort. You don't think about transformation because you have become the transformation. But before this natural state emerges, you must navigate the territory between old and new. You must learn to live simultaneously in two realities. The reality of your current circumstances and the reality of your fulfilled assumption. Most people cannot handle this tension. They either abandon their assumption when circumstances remain unchanged, or they deny their circumstances while clinging to their assumption. Both approaches create suffering and prevent true transformation. The master learns to hold both realities without contradiction. They acknowledge current circumstances without being defined by them. They maintain their assumption without denying present conditions. This ability to hold paradox is the mark of an awakened consciousness. The ordinary mind demands that reality be consistent, logical, sequential. The awakened mind recognizes that consciousness operates beyond the limitations of linear thinking. You can be broke and wealthy simultaneously. Broke in your bank account, wealthy in your assumption. Lonely and loved simultaneously. Lonely in your current circumstances, loved in your consciousness of fulfillment. This is not self-deception. This is the recognition that consciousness and circumstances operate on different levels of reality. Consciousness is cause. Circumstances are effect. Effects change when causes change, but there is always a gap between cause and effect. In this gap you must learn to live with absolute certainty in your cause, while remaining unattached to the timing of effects. This requires a level of spiritual maturity that few develop. It requires the ability to see beyond appearances to the underlying movement of consciousness into form. It requires faith in processes that cannot be seen or measured by ordinary means. Watch how a farmer plants seeds in the fall, knowing that spring will bring the harvest. The farmer doesn't dig up the seeds to check their progress. The farmer doesn't worry that the ground looks empty and barren. The farmer trusts in the invisible process of growth happening beneath the surface. Your assumption works the same way. Once planted in consciousness through the three pillars, it begins its inevitable journey toward manifestation. Your job is not to monitor the process or try to control the timing. Your job is to maintain the inner conditions that allow the process to unfold naturally. These conditions include unwavering certainty in your assumption, complete detachment from outcomes, and absolute trust in the intelligence of consciousness itself. Most people reverse this approach. They become attached to outcomes while doubting their assumption. They try to control timing while questioning the process. They seek evidence while undermining the very consciousness that creates evidence. This backwards approach creates the very delays and obstacles they fear. Attachment creates resistance. Control creates struggle. Doubt creates contradiction. The master flows in the opposite direction. They become completely unattached to when or how their assumption manifests, while maintaining absolute certainty that it will manifest. They trust the process completely while releasing all need to control outcomes. This surrender is not passive resignation. This surrender is active trust in the supreme intelligence that governs all manifestation. This surrender is the recognition that consciousness knows exactly how to transform assumption into experience. When you reach this level of surrender, manifestation becomes effortless. Not because you stop caring about your desires, but because you stop struggling against the natural process of their fulfillment. From this place of effortless assumption, your entire life begins to reorganize around your new identity. The person who assumes wealth thinks differently than the person who lacks money. The person who assumes love behaves differently than the person who feels lonely. The person who assumes success moves differently than the person who fears failure. These differences are not forced or performed. These differences emerge naturally from the shift in consciousness. When you truly identify with your fulfilled self, you automatically begin to think, feel, speak, and act as that fulfilled self would. This natural expression of your assumed identity is what creates the conditions for external manifestation. People respond to your new energy, opportunities align with your new vibration. Synchronicities multiply around your new state of being. But these external changes are not your primary concern. Your primary concern is the integrity of your inner state. When you maintain perfect inner alignment with your assumption, external alignment follows naturally. This inner integrity requires constant vigilance, but not the kind of vigilance most people practice. Not the desperate vigilance of trying to control thoughts or force feelings. The gentle vigilance of a loving parent watching over a sleeping child. You watch your consciousness with caring attention. When old patterns of limitation arise, you gently redirect your awareness back to assumption. When doubt whispers in the corners of your mind, you lovingly return to certainty. When fear attempts to reassert itself, you compassionately choose trust. This gentle vigilance becomes second nature with practice. You develop an internal radar that immediately detects when you have slipped out of assumptive consciousness. This radar allows you to make quick corrections before old patterns can gain momentum. Over time, these corrections become smaller and less frequent. Your consciousness learns to maintain the frequency of fulfilled assumption with minimal effort. Like a skilled musician who can play beautiful melodies without conscious thought. You learn to live from assumption without constant monitoring. At this stage, assumptive living becomes your default state rather than your conscious practice. You don't have to remember to assume fulfillment monity. You simply live from fulfillment. You don't have to choose confidence. Confidence chooses you. You don't have to practice certainty. Certainty becomes your natural expression. This transformation affects every area of your existence. Your relationships improve not because you try to improve them, but because you are relating from a fundamentally different place within yourself. Your work becomes more satisfying, not because you force satisfaction, but because you are bringing a fulfilled self to your activities. Your health improves not because you focus on health, but because stress and struggle naturally decrease when you stop fighting against your own assumptions. Your creativity expands not because you try to be creative, but because fulfillment is inherently creative. These improvements ripple outward from your transformed consciousness like waves spreading across still water. Everyone you meet feels the difference in your presence. Every situation you enter is affected by your new way of being. But perhaps the most profound change is in your relationship with time itself. The ordinary person lives in constant anticipation of future fulfillment. They endure the present while waiting for someday. They postpone happiness until conditions align perfectly. The master of assumption lives in present fulfillment. They don't wait for someday because they recognize that someday is now. They don't postpone happiness because they understand that happiness is their natural state when not obscured by limitation. This shift from future-oriented hoping to present moment fulfillment changes everything about how you experience life. You stop rushing toward imaginary destinations. You stop measuring your worth by external achievements. You stop sacrificing today for the promise of tomorrow. Instead, you rest in the profound satisfaction of already being what you thought you needed to become. You recognize that what you were seeking was always available in this moment. You understand that fulfillment is not a destination to reach but a consciousness to inhabit. From this consciousness of present fulfillment, you naturally attract the external forms that match your inner state. Not because you are trying to attract them, but because attraction is the natural law of consciousness. Like attracts like. What you are within yourself, you experience in your world. This attraction happens not through desperate wanting or manipulative techniques, but through authentic being. When you genuinely are the consciousness of love, love appears in your experience. When you authentically embody the consciousness of abundance, manifests in your circumstances. The key word is authenticity. You cannot fake this consciousness. You cannot pretend your way into fulfillment. You cannot perform assumption while secretly maintaining limitation. Consciousness is too intelligent to be fooled by surface performances. Consciousness responds only to genuine shifts in your fundamental sense of self. When you truly become the person who already has what you desire, consciousness has no choice but to mirror that identity in your experience. This mirroring is not immediate in the physical world because consciousness must work through the laws of form, time, and space. But the mirroring begins immediately in the invisible realms of energy, possibility, and potential. These invisible changes precede and create visible changes. The shifts in energy precede shifts in circumstances. The movements in possibility precede movements in form. The transformations in potential precede transformations in actuality. When you understand this sequence, you stop looking for immediate physical evidence of your assumption. You trust the invisible process, knowing that visible results are inevitable when consciousness is properly aligned. This trust allows you to maintain your assumption through apparent delays, setbacks, and contradictions. You recognize these challenges not as evidence that assumption isn't working, but as the natural resistance that consciousness encounters as it moves from one level of manifestation to another. Think of water flowing from a high place to a low place. The water doesn't flow in a straight line. It moves around obstacles, through valleys, over rocks. But it never stops flowing toward its destination. The obstacles don't stop the water, they simply determine the path the water takes. Your assumption flows toward manifestation the same way. Obstacles don't stop the process manifest, they simply determine the path your assumption takes as it transforms into experience. This understanding gives you infinite patience with the process and absolute confidence in the outcome. You don't need to know the path. You don't need to understand the timing. You don't need to figure out the methods. You simply need to maintain the assumption and trust consciousness to handle all the details of manifestation. This level of trust represents the ultimate maturity of assumptive living. You no longer need to understand how assumption works. You no longer need
To monitor the process, you no longer need to seek evidence or confirmation. You simply live from the consciousness of fulfilled desire, and allow that consciousness to express itself through your experience in whatever way serves the highest good. From this place of ultimate trust, you become a blessing to everyone around you. Your presence reminds others of their own power to assume fulfillment. Your example demonstrates what becomes possible when someone lives from assumption rather than limitation.
You become living proof that circumstances don't determine consciousness. Consciousness determines circumstances. You embody the truth that waiting for external change is unnecessary when internal change is possible now. This is your gift to the world. Not the specific things you manifest, but the consciousness you embody. Not the external successes you achieve, but the inner freedom you demonstrate. The world needs people who live from assumption rather than limitation. The world needs individuals who demonstrate that fulfillment is available now, not someday. The world needs examples of what becomes possible when consciousness is properly understood and applied. You are capable of becoming such an example. You have within you right now everything required to live from the assumption of fulfilled desire. You don't need more knowledge, more preparation, more favorable circumstances. You need only the willingness to step into the consciousness you have always possessed, but perhaps forgotten how to access. This stepping into assumed fulfillment is not a single moment of decision. This stepping is a continuous choosing, moment by moment, breath by breath, thought by thought. Each time you choose assumption over limitation, you strengthen your capacity to live from fulfillment. Each time you choose presence over distraction, you deepen your access to the stillness that holds all possibility. Each time you choose response over reaction, you reclaim the power to create rather than merely react. These choices accumulate into a transformed way of being. This transformed way of being naturally creates a transformed experience of life. This transformed experience becomes your gift to yourself and your contribution to the world. The assumption of fulfilled desire is ultimately about remembering who you are beneath all the layers of conditioning, programming, and forgetting. It is about returning to the natural state of consciousness that is already complete, already whole, already fulfilled. From this recognition, all desires become expressions of joy rather than attempts to escape pain. All manifestations become celebrations of consciousness rather than desperate grasping for satisfaction. This is the ultimate transformation, not from lacking to having, but from seeking to being. Not from emptiness to fullness, but from forgetting to remembering. Not from limitation to freedom, but from dream to awakening. You are not trying to become something you are not. You are remembering something you have always been. You are not trying to get something you lack. You are recognizing something you have always possessed. This recognition is available now. This remembering is possible now. This assumption is accessible now. The only question that remains is whether you will choose to live from this truth or continue to live from the illusion of separation from your desires. The choice is yours. The power is yours. The fulfillment is yours. It always has been.